just because you have the keys to the place doesn't actually make it a home, right? The way you stop conflict is with kindness. We don't fight fire with fire. You will burn your house down. All right, guys, so my wife and I got married on April 1st of 2020, about 2 weeks after the world shut down. By the way, not recommended to get married during a pandemic, but that's what we did. We had a beach wedding planned. We had about 300 people that we'd invited, people from church, lots of her family, lots of my family. And then one day in March, out of nowhere, we had to start calling people and let them know that our wedding was going to look much different than originally planned and that they would no longer be able to attend, which most of them were okay with because they were scared and didn't want to leave the house anyway. And anyway, we still got married on April 1st, April Fool's Day. So if I ever forget our anniversary, I always get an extra day and just tell her, joke's on you, right? Hasn't worked yet. But, so we got married. We had about 10 people in attendance. And that was also the day that we were moving into our first apartment together. And so I spent the whole day moving as much of our furniture as possible from both of our previous living situations into our apartment. Now, one thing I realized is that just because you have the keys to the place, to a house, to an apartment, whatever, doesn't actually make it a home, right? It takes a little bit more than that. Like some of you guys own a home, own a house, maybe a piece of land, but I would bet that it took a little bit of time before that house really became a home. For our apartment, it was decorating. It took some time to get the couch and the TV and the dining room table in the spots that we wanted it. For your house, if that's you, it took some time before it really became a home. But then, even once you owned your home and once it became a home, it's likely that some projects came up, right? I was just at a friend's house yesterday where their toilet exploded. Projects happen. You need a new roof. You develop a leak somewhere. Your AC goes out, Campbell Cooling for the win. I see you over there, right? And you have to do some work. You got to pay more money. You have to shell out more money to keep that home from turning into just a house again. And houses are on a constant downward slope towards chaos unless you are intentional with keeping up with all of the management that owning a home requires. It requires an intentional act of the will to keep the house a place that is safe and warm and allows your family to thrive. Well, why do I bring that up? Because relationships are the same way. That we drift towards isolation without intentionality. Think of your old high school friends. Once you graduated, you didn't really see them again unless you were intentional about reaching out, right? The relationship doesn't just keep itself vibrant, it takes work, usually from both parties. And what's true for your friendship is also true for our marriage. Not our marriage, your marriage with your spouse. That without effort, without work, we will drift towards isolation because that is the pull of our society. And that even now, if you're younger, newlywed, feeling just so in love and think that this will never happen to you, I promise, just wait. Right? Because he's going to come home from work and she's going to come home from work and you'll order a pizza and watch TV without an inkling of meaningful conversation with your significant other. And then eventually kids get involved and they enter the picture and you have to tend to their needs. And then you realize that you're just roommates, not because you stopped loving the other person, but because you stopped trying. And the reality is that in order for us to have safe, warm marriages for our families, we have to intentionally work to repair and refurbish them like we do the homes that we live in. And so today, we're going to be in Song of Solomon chapter 5. We're going to watch a young couple navigate conflict and do it well? A little backstory on A Song of Solomon, just to be a little helpful here. In Song of Solomon, we have a young man and a young woman who are smitten for one another. And so in chapter 1, we meet our guy and our gal and discover that there is an attraction there, that they like the appearance and like the reputation that the other person has. In chapter 2, a courtship starts to happen. They start to get to know one another. They start going on dates. In chapter 3, we see a wedding. In chapter 4, we see the honeymoon, we see the consummation of that wedding. And I think it's even worth reading just a little bit of that. These are some of my favorite verses in all of the Bible. These also work as great pickup lines should you need them. He says, "How beautiful you are, my darling. Oh, how beautiful. Your eyes behind your veil are doves. Your hair is like a flock of goats descending from the hills of Gilead." Right? He goes on. "Your teeth are like a flock of sheep just shorn, coming up from the washing. Each one has its twin, not one of them is alone." You know what that's saying? She's got all her teeth. That's great. That's right? Like, these are the words that he's using to woo his woman on the wedding night. The goat hair thing works, though. I have a second baby on the way, so you can trust me. And so they have their honeymoon. Things are good. Everything's wonderful. They're so in love. And then chapter 5 comes along, and now we find ourselves in the midst of our first conflict. And so there are some of you in this room who are not married, and I just want to speak into that a little bit before we dive in. I was doing some reading. There's a few factors that play into why someone doesn't want to get married. And there's all sorts of financial reasons. There's all sorts of reasons about not wanting to be tied down to one person. But research has shown that about 54% of unmarried people between the ages of 21 and 25, right? So we're talking a few millennials, some Gen Z, that the ones who don't want to get married, their reason is that they don't want to get divorced. That the reason they don't want to get married is because they don't want to get divorced, meaning that they've seen another couple try and fail, and they don't want that. That the biggest driving force among married, single people not wanting to get married comes from watching other couples not know how to navigate through conflict well. And so even if you're not married, there is a need to know how to navigate through conflict. Because conflict has the opportunity to either separate further or link closer. There have been conflicts that my wife Christy and I have had that have actually brought us into a deeper understanding of one another and has deepened our relationship and our communication. And so we are going to see this couple struggle well and move through adversity well. And so if you're with me in chapter 5, we're going to start in verse 2. She says this, "I slept, but my heart was awake. Listen, my beloved is knocking." And then he says, "Open to me, my sister, my darling, my dove, my flawless one. My head is drenched with dew, my hair with the dampness of the night." So here's the picture. The honeymoon is over. The guy has gone back to work and probably worked a little bit later than he said he was going to. And in waiting for him to come home, she's gone to bed. But now she hears him knocking. And listen to what he says. "Open to me, my sister, my darling, my dove, my flawless one." What do you think this man has on his mind? This is the same language he used on the honeymoon night, right? Like he says, "My head is drenched." He says, "It's a hard world out there, but I have overcome all the obstacles to come back to you, my little love, darling princess." What's happening in his mind? Right? Listen to a little Marvin Gaye on the way home. And yet her response, verse 3, I have taken off my robe. Must I put it on again? I have washed my feet. Must I soil them again? What kind of response is that? Well, in Hebrew, it sounds something like, I've got a headache. I haven't shaved my legs. I've got work in the morning. Right? And so he's shut down. Candles are out, vibe check, not good. There has been some kind of miscommunication. We have different expectations. You want rest, I want intimacy, and now this couple who is so in love has entered conflict for the first time. This is going to happen in marriage. Typically, there are 5 big areas of conflict in marriage. Married people, feel free to amen or groan audibly when I get to yours, whatever feels safest to you. But there's 5. Here they are. The first one is in-laws. Oh, how to navigate time with them. Expectations of how the in-laws will be treated. Often expectations from the in-laws of how you're treating their son or their daughter. Money. Not usually how much we have, but what is our value system? How do we determine what we are going to spend our resources on? As an example, I think a $100 haircut is the craziest thing I've ever heard in my life. Meanwhile, my wife doesn't quite understand why I need different guitars, even though I've shown her that they all sound just like 1% different. Number 3, roles. Who does what? Who cooks? Who cleans? Many people come into marriage thinking that it'll be just like their families did it, but that doesn't always work out, right? And then not to mention different standards. Like he's going to make the bed and he's going to think it's done and that he nailed it, and she's going to think he's an idiot because it looks like a disaster. Kids, how many do we want? Private school, public school, homeschool? What does disciplining them like? Are they going to be a timeout kind of kid or a spanking kind of kid? And then communication. Can we safely talk about the way that we feel without fear of judgment? Can we navigate through our expectations? In all of these areas, there will be conflict. How do you respond to conflict? How do you respond when your desires and goals and expectations go unmet? There will be conflict. I had a friend once, Christy and I, while we were engaged, got into a fight, and I was like, I'm over it. And I talked to this friend about it. And this friend told me, listen, you're going to fight with somebody for the rest of your life. Do you want that to be Christy? I said, yeah, I do. I want to fight Christy the rest of my life, right? And so how do we respond? How is our boy here going to respond? Is he going to punch a hole in the wall, yell, shut down, roll his eyes? Well, in verse 4, if you're still with me, she says, my beloved thrust his hand through the latch opening, and my heart began to pound for him. I arose to open for my beloved, and my hands dripped with myrrh, my fingers with flowing myrrh on the handles of the bolt. I don't know if you've bought myrrh recently, but it was expensive. It was imported from India and Arabia, and it was very costly. Women used it very sparingly due to its price. And so catch what happens here. When he was offended or hurt or felt rejected, instead of reacting in anger, he anoints the door with an expensive perfume, with an expensive oil, right? To anoint something means to bless it. And he blesses it so much that the handle is dripping. So how do you respond to a conflict in marriage? Well, number 1, you don't retaliate. Never retaliate. 1 Peter in chapter 3, he teaches us this. He says, do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult. On the contrary, repay evil with blessing, because to this you were called, so that you may inherit a blessing. For whoever would love life and see good days must keep their tongue from evil and their lips from deceitful speech. They must turn from evil and do good. They must seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are attentive to their prayer, but the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. Why does God value this? Why does God value not retaliating and seeking peace instead? Because that's what God does with us every single day. That over and over and over again, we offend God, and God does not retaliate against us. Rather, he is patient with us. He's kind with us. Romans chapter 4 talks about how it's the kindness of God that draws us to repentance. And so when conflict arises, we don't retaliate, we bless. Another scripture passage real quick in Proverbs 26, he says this, as charcoal to embers and as wood to fire, so is a quarrelsome person for kindling strife. We don't fight fire with fire. You will burn your house down. There was a UFC fighter a few years ago, and in an interview, he worked as a nightclub bouncer before he made it to the UFC. And the interviewer asked, what did you used to do when it was time to break up a fight in the nightclub? And the fighter said that when he saw tensions rise, the first thing he would do was compliment the guy. Right? He'd walk up and he'll step right between, and he's like breaking up fighting. He's like, oh, by the way, nice shirt. And so he would compliment the guy. He said the second thing he would do was empathize. He'd say something like, yeah, that would frustrate me too. And then lastly, he would offer to buy the guy or however many guys are involved a drink and suggest that they all kind of go their separate ways and enjoy the night before the night goes in a direction that doesn't benefit any of them. And you could tell the interviewer was kind of bummed, right? He was hoping that he'd be like, yeah, so I would punch him in the throat and then kick him in the face. But no, he says the way you stop conflict is with kindness. And then don't wait until they deserve it. God doesn't do that with us. Going on in verse 6. So he's gone. In verse 6, she says, I opened for my beloved, but my beloved had left. He was gone. My heart sank at his departure. I looked for him, but did not find him. I called him, but he did not answer. Right? So she realizes that there's a disconnect now. And so she's seeking out reconciliation. That's the second thing. We seek out reconciliation. She seeks after him. Verse 7, the watchmen found me as they made their rounds in the city. They beat me, they bruised me, they took away my cloak, those watchmen of the walls. Biblical scholars, because this is a poem, believe this to be allegorical. They don't believe this to be literal. They don't think that she got beat up. They believe the watchman to be like her conscience. And so the idea here is that she's being convicted. And then verse 8, she goes to her friend. She says, daughters of Jerusalem, I charge you, if you find my beloved, what will you tell him? Tell him I am faint with love. Right? So she approaches her friends, and they're not super helpful. She's like, have you seen my man? Right? I want him. I need him. Friends are not helpful here. They say, how is your beloved better than others, most beautiful of women? How is your beloved better than others that you so charge us? Right? So they're like, what's so good about him? And instead of just letting them talk smack about him, she tells them exactly what is so good about him. I'd also like to mention that my wife has never said any of this about me. Verse 10, she says, my beloved is radiant and ruddy, outstanding among 10,000. His head is purest gold. His hair is wavy and black as raven. So he's got nice hair. Not essential, right, that men have flowing locks, just throwing it out there. This is my favorite verse in the entire Bible because nobody has any idea what it means. Verse 12, his eyes are like doves by the water streams, washed in milk, mounted like jewels. Hazel? His cheeks are like beds of spice, yielding perfume. His lips are like lilies dripping with myrrh. His arms are rods of gold set with topaz. His body is like polished ivory decorated with lapis lazuli. Come on, Christy. His legs are pillars of marble set on bases of pure gold. His appearance is like Lebanon, choice as its cedars. His mouth is sweetness itself. He is altogether lovely. This is my beloved. This is my friend, daughters of Jerusalem. She says, I'll tell you what's so good about him. His hair, his eyes, his cheeks, his lips, his arms, his body, his legs. She has a PhD in everything that she loves about her man. And so their question forces her to recall what she loves and respects about him so much. That is number 3. Recall what you love and respect so much about your spouse in the midst of conflict. And by the way, this one goes against every fiber of our being. Because when there is conflict, we always want to try to compare our strengths to their weaknesses. But that's impossible. You can't do that. That's apples to oranges. You can't take all of your strengths and compare them to somebody else's shortcomings as if you're some kind of standard and they need to rise to your level. And you don't like it when they compare their strengths to your shortcomings. But this is what sin does. It highlights your virtues and it downplays your inadequacies. And it highlights their inadequacies and downplays their virtues. And so instead, list out the things that you love about your spouse. List out the reasons that you married that person. And so here, in the midst of conflict, she describes him from head to toe. And then chapter 6, her friends have a change of tune. They say, where is your beloved gone, most beautiful of women? Which way did your beloved turn that we may look for him with you? My beloved has gone down to his garden, to the beds of spices, to browse in the gardens, and to gather lilies. I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine. He browses among the lilies. And then they come together to work out their conflict, and this is his response. He says, you are as beautiful as Tirzah, my darling, as lovely as Jerusalem. Tirzah was the most beautiful city in the north. Jerusalem was the most beautiful city in the south. He says, you're as lovely as they are, as majestic as troops with banners. Turn your eyes from me. They overwhelm me. And then catch this. He says, your hair is a flock of goats descending from Gilead. Your teeth are like a flock of sheep coming up from the washing. Each has its own. Not one of them is missing. Your temples behind your veil are like halves of a pomegranate. 60 queens there may be, and 80 concubines, and virgins beyond number, but my dove, my perfect one, is unique. The only daughter of her mother, the favorite of the one who bore her. The young women saw her and called her blessed. The queens and concubines praised her. So this is the idea. They come back together, and he says almost the exact same thing he said to her on her wedding night. That he is still committed to her. That he still loves her as much as he did then, and that nothing is going to break that. Nothing is going to break their covenant. A covenant, by the way, is a no matter what kind of relationship. It's the kind of relationship that in sickness and health, in good times and bad, till death do we part, no matter what kind of relationship. That is the kind of relationship a marriage is, that no conflict can come between. It's the kind of relationship that God establishes with us through Jesus. That though we are sinful, though we are broken, God establishes a no matter what kind of covenant with you and with me. And that was established through Jesus, who came and lived a perfect life and died the death that you and I deserved and rose so that all of our sin and all of our shame would be forgiven. That our conflict with God would be resolved as Jesus rose, proving that sin and death had been overcome. And we can seek resolution with our spouses because marriage is and always has been a picture of the gospel. Marriage is and always has been a picture of Christ and his church. And so we'll close here. It's with the gospel in mind. And let's be honest with ourselves, right? Some of us need to leave here and have a really honest conversation with somebody. And we need to apologize. We don't need to wait for them to deserve it. We don't need to wait for them to feel sorry too. Forgiveness begins with the apology that you never receive. God didn't wait for us to deserve it. We would be waiting forever, and the gospel wouldn't be good news. One final quote that I just thought was worth sharing here. It comes from C.S. Lewis. He says that being a Christian means to forgive the inexcusable because the inexcusable was forgiven in you. And I want to switch it up just a little bit. Being in a marriage covenant with somebody means to forgive the inexcusable because you know that in the ultimate covenant, the inexcusable was forgiven in you. Let's pray together.